I want to touch on a survey. This was fascinating. I read this the other day, and it's basically about how Canadians feel, and it's built along demographic lines. Younger Canadians feel unlucky and unattached to the country. They don't have that same sense of belonging, I guess. Whereas, well, baby boomers, for instance, who've been in charge for the last little while, are kind of looking and saying, hey, things are fine. That we're in pretty good shape, and we love this country, and we love what we've made of it. There was a generation chasm when it comes to attitudes about this country. And it's a fascinating study. The people that commissioned this are going to join us. Ray Pennings is the executive vice president of Cardus, who commissioned the study along with our good friends at Angus Reid. Ray, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for the time, and thanks for getting the work done on this. This is a very innovative and novel idea to try to get the mood as to what's going on here from a demographic standpoint. And it tells a rather interesting story, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. Thanks for having me, Bill.
Let's talk a little bit about this and about attitudes. And for those of us, I guess most of us fall into one of these two or three categories that you talked about here, whether the baby boomers, millennials, and others. Generation X, I guess, falls into this as well. Very different perception about what Canada is and what it should be going forward.
Indeed. The study itself, there are lots of disputes about, exactly where the boundaries are between boomers and Xers and millennials. At the core of the study looked at those over 40 and under 40, and then we, broke it down further from there. But Cardus is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and what we wanted to do was to take a look at the next 20 years. And one thing that should be highlighted is this poll oversamples leaders. So we looked at a Notre Dame study in terms of a number of dimensions of leadership, and then also asked about people's involvement. Are they, are they actively doing stuff? And those that were on the highest segment of that, we categorized as leaders. And what we wanted to see is, the leadership that we can expect in this country over the next 20 years, how are their core values and perspectives the same or different than those that currently are in charge? And as you indicated, we found a very stark contrast. For most of those currently in leadership, they're building on foundations, and they'll talk about fixing mistakes and renovating, but really the foundations are in place. But if you take those under 40, 43% of those under the age of 40 basically say that we need to start new and we need to restructure society in a very different way. And we tease that out in terms of a whole host of institutions and their relationship with most of our society's institutions, whether it's government, whether it's faith institutions, whether it's community organizations, they vary somewhat, but there's a lot of distrust and alienation from the institutions of society.
One of the ones that jumped out at me here, though, Ray, which I think explains an awful lot of the consternation we might feel here, is, as you mentioned, the self-identified young leaders under age 41 say that basically they're societal types. In other words, the greater good for society should supersede everything else. When you look at some of the people that are over that 41 group, they're talking more about individual rights and freedoms. It's a totally different mindset, isn't it?
It is, and you highlighted the difference in terms of rights. That's there. What I found interesting as well is in terms of economics. There was a whole list of things and people had to prioritize them. Things like balancing the budget and economic growth in that belong to an older generation. Yeah. The younger generation was much more concerned about equality, affordability, not economics in terms of how do we make more, but how do we distribute fairly what we have. So a very different mindset even as they think about economic issues.
I'm trying to extrapolate some mindsets, I guess, from these numbers because it's a fascinating survey. I'm wondering if that difference is basically because of the way the boomers were raised. Their parents had nothing, and I think the mantra for just about everybody who had kids back in those days was, we want our kids to be better. We want them to have better education, a better house, a better this, better that. And it was all about the bottom line, make sure that you had financial stability because that generation didn't. But when you look at the under 41s, and we saw that, I think, reflected most recently, I guess, in the federal election we had here in Canada, issues like the environment, issues like Indigenous rights, things of this nature, in their minds superseded all those other things that the other generation thought were more important.
It is true, although I put a couple of caveats to this. I personally was surprised. We did this poll in August, so just before the federal election was called was when we were in the field. Okay. Indigenous had already slipped to fourth or fifth on the list at that time. While climate change was on the top for all generations, it doesn't matter, leaders or followers, doesn't matter which demographic you were in, climate change was the number one issue. But after that, the issues varied significantly by age. And Indigenous, one would have thought with the residential schools question being in the news as prominent as it had for several months, that already had slipped, even among younger demographics, fairly surprisingly down the list. I think the one thing, you mentioned in terms of how people were raised and with expectations, and it's true, the younger generation feels unluckier in parts, but yet they feel lucky. It's not as if they're saying it's all terrible. They're less optimistic than the older generation. One of the things that I found quite surprising was this real drive for authenticity. If you take a look at, this is the group that, if you take a look at faith backgrounds, this is the group that the smallest number formally had, been baptized, or if they were Jew, bar mitzvah, or the entrance into any particular faith. And yet, on a per capita basis, the people most likely to have attended a place of worship in the last month or to have read a sacred text are those under the age of 30. So they're not in the mushy middle. They don't self-identify. They're either religious or non-religious. But we asked about faith, we asked about morality, we asked about how do you make your decisions, and how do you, are you following the core values that you were raised with, or have you converted or changed, and what caused that sort of thing. There is a very different approach in terms of openness among younger Canadians, whereas older Canadians are a little more set in their ways and are following through, as you said, some of the things that they have inherited.
And we have to be careful when we use terms like optimism and pessimism about this, because I don't want to get the impression that that the millennials are saying, well, that there's no future here. But when they say the change, what's the message there, Ray? When they say, well, we need to do things differently, is that hey, we can't continue to do things the way they were because that's what got us to where we are now, facing some of these concerns and some of these challenges. It just seems as if the message here is, let's expand the horizons. Let's not just think, okay, these are the only things we can do. Let's think outside the box for some of these solutions. Or,
it's always, you get the data and it's open to various interpretation. Yeah. I don't think there's any one right way to look at this necessarily. One of the things that as I've been, digging into this, it strikes me that they're looking at what they have been handed in terms of a legacy and saying, maybe Canada isn't in as great a shape as the boomers think it is. Maybe we are inheriting something that isn't quite working as well as it is, and we need to focus on fixing some stuff. So there is a sense in which it's not just looking at the future, but an assessment of the present, which is inherent in all of this. I would also say that the next generation, you had mentioned in terms of economic values and getting wealth in their own career, they seem to have a little less emphasis on that and a little more focus on broader social goals and a sense of the common good. They also feel privileged. They acknowledge they've had more opportunity to travel than their parents. They're better educated than their parents. They've had more opportunities to express themselves. So there is a lot of positives that are expressed among the under 40s. So when they look at themselves versus their parents, housing is one big area that they're very in affordability, but it's not as if they're saying we automatically want to swap spots.
No, and the idea about hey, boomers, you didn't hand us this fabulous situation here. We've got some concerns, and I guess that's when we get into the subsets of things like environment and things of this nature, and the human rights issues, I guess, because I guess it's almost the job, isn't it, of every generation, Ray, to hand it down to the next generation, say here's what we've done with it, take it, and you like to think that. As we all do, that we're going to leave it better than it was when we started, and I think the message I'm hearing from some of the millennials here is, well, boomers, it maybe is not that much better than when you started. That you messed up on a lot of things here, but I'm getting the sense that there's some optimism here that says, yeah, but you know what, we got this now. I think we've got some different ideas, and maybe these are going to work.
And there's a strong sense of agency. In terms of do you think you can make a difference? Do you, are you optimistic? There were, half a dozen sorts of questions that got at it. And consistently, there's a sense of agency. This isn't a pessimistic. It is analysis of where we're at, but it is a realistic one to say all is not good. And we need to look in different places than we have been over the last little while in terms of finding some answers.
Well, as you mentioned, these are the young leaders. These are the under 41s, and I was going to say they're not just the leaders of tomorrow; they're the leaders of today. It's a younger demographic, a younger generation. What did you take out of this? Are you optimistic about the future now that as we hand the mantle to these people that this different attitude that they're taking right now is going to do well for not just for globally, but I mean here in Canada?
Yeah, no, overall, I think there are many reasons for optimism in this. Cardus, as you know, is a think tank that looks also at the role of faith in public life and our core beliefs, where they come from. One of the things I was encouraged by is that, we have seen, we asked the question on the poll, as we have previously, in terms of, do you think the presence of and we ask about 8 different faith groups: Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, evangelicals, Catholics. Do you think these groups are damaging or benefiting society? What is interesting is the younger demographic. The historic answer is the less religious you are, the more negative you view every other religion. So if you're a religious Sikh, you tend to view Jews, Muslims, Christians much more positively than if you're non-religious. In fact, those who are in the most non-religious category view every other group as net damaging to society. They don't think anyone else is benefiting society except non-religious people. What is interesting is there's a significant change in demographics. The younger you are, the way more open you are in terms of people of different perspectives. And there's a real value of authenticity. There's there's 10% more openness to people expressing themselves, even people they disagree with, in public life. So when it comes to issues of tolerance and respect, especially in a pluralistic country, I think there are some very hopeful signs here about a next generation that is searching for answers, is finding them in different places, but is wanting to have a very authentic conversation about it.
Well, with that attitude, does that indicate that maybe that generation don't see those hard and fast lines between this religion versus that religion?
Actually, and it's hard to know, one would have to dig a little deeper. My own sense is that they tend to be more conservative, if you will, or orthodox in their own religious expression than were their parents. And we have a whole range of questions in terms of where it's at. By and large, the younger, whereas in the older generation, you had people who sort of inherited a faith, went to church at Christmas and Easter, but for the rest, it wasn't a meaningful part of their lives. Younger people are saying, listen, I'm not going to bother with that. I'm either going to be serious about it or I'm not going to be religious. There's no social advantage to having religious pretenses. And the result of that is that you are having, right across the board in the different faith communities, this isn't just tied to Catholics or evangelicals or Protestants, it's as I said, the various faith communities, one senses that when those who are religious are more serious about their faith, and those who aren't are not pretending.
It's a fascinating study, and I think very eye-opening and insightful. It gives us some, I think, me anyway, some positive feelings about what's going to be happening in the future as we do hand the mantle off to that generation. Ray, thank you so much for the great work that you guys did on this, and thanks for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Bill.
Ray Pennings, Executive Vice President of Cardus, who was sponsored the survey, along with Angus Reid.